How did Carlos Correa become the first player in Major League history to sign $800 million worth of contracts in one offseason? How did he do it? Well, the timeline between Carlos Correa and the start of free agency compared to now has been a bumpy ride. It's been pretty crazy, and most people know about it, but the actual span of time that has gone on from him agreeing to a contract with the Giants, then to the Mets, and then to the Twins, a lot of time hasn't actually elapsed. It's only been about 2.5, 3 weeks. So we wanted to break it down. We wanted to talk about Carlos Correa, how he was able to ink over $800 million worth of money for just himself, but he's actually going to only end up getting about 200 million, maybe more, maybe less. It depends on what's going on with his contract with the Twins, how many different player options he signs and things of that nature, right? So let's start from the beginning. Carlos Correa becomes a free agent. Actually, let's start before this offseason and go past offseason. Carlos Correa, last offseason, is a free agent and decides, you know what, I'm going to agree to essentially a 1-year contract with the Twins. Essentially. It was a 3-year contract, but there was a opt-out for Correa after each one of the years of the 3-year contract with the Twins. He was going to be making about $35 a year if he stayed for all 3 years. And last year he went to Minnesota, participated in the Twins team for the one season, and decided, you know, I'm going to opt out of my contract because I'm still very young. I'm still marketable, still at the peak of my playing career and in the prime. So I'm going to opt out and test free agency. Then the rumors start swirling around, right? You talk about teams like the Giants. You talk about a reunion with the Twins. The Astros had moved on. The Cubs were looking for a shortstop. There was a lot of names, a lot of numbers, a lot of dollar signs being thrown around, including Carlos Correa in the conversations. How much is Correa going to sign for? How many years does Correa want? How much does he want per season? All that stuff gets thrown around. Then there's the huge flurry of offseason activity to start this offseason in Major League Baseball. And the shortstops were flying off the shelf. Flying off the shelf. Bogarts to the Padres, Swanson to the Cubs, Trey Turner to the Phillies. Carlos Correa is sitting back going, what do I got to do to get a contract around here? I'm better than all these guys. Or at least he thinks. It's debatable where he actually stands in the rankings of all the shortstops that were available in free agency. But that point is neither here nor there, because the main focal point is that Correa was looking for a long-term contract, and all these other shortstops were signing monster long-term contracts. Turner, 11 years to the Phillies. Bogarts, 11 years to the Padres. Correa is like 28 years old. He's like, dude, come on. Where's my deal at? Carlos Correa agrees to a contract with the Giants, the San Francisco Giants, 13 years, $350 million. The important thing to note in that conversation or in that talking point, not just with this specific agreement with the Giants, but in general, when players get reported by Jeff Passan of ESPN, by John Heyman, by any of the other MLB reporters or beat writers, that there's a contract agreement, that's all it is a mutual agreement on a years and a dollar figure between the team and the player/agent. Nothing has been signed. No physicals have been done. But it still gets reported because for the most part, I mean, it's a very, very rare occurrence that a player goes through the process of getting a physical, especially when they're a young, athletic, 28-year-old shortstop type player that hasn't had a ton of history of injury. It's very unlikely for them to go through the process of getting the physical and for anything to come up that would hinder the agreement to go through between the team and the player. Well, as we all know, Carlos Correa, after reaching the agreement with the Giants, had to go through the process of getting a physical, just like anybody else. He comes to the agreement with the Giants on the 14th of December. Less than a week later, on December 20th, right before the Giants were scheduled to run an introductory press conference to introduce Carlos Correa as a member of the Giants. Before they have to do that official press conference, of course, they're not just going to do it without him having signed all the paperwork and be officially inked as a member of the Giants. Right before the press conference was scheduled to go off, apparently there was enough that came back from the results of Carlos Correa's physical with the Giants medical staff that essentially it raised enough red flags for them to go out back to the Correa camp, back to Scott Boras, his agent, and essentially say, we actually aren't prepared to commit that amount of money and that long of a contract to a player who didn't go through this physical process unscathed. Some stuff came up, whether it was career threatening, which in this case it doesn't sound like it is, or they just felt like it was going to be something that was going to hinder his performance, especially towards the back end of his career, right? Or just keep him on the field consistently, because when you're going to pay that much money and commit that amount of time to a player, you're going to want him to play, man, like 140, 150 games. And they felt like with what they now know, that wasn't going to happen. So they canceled the introductory press conference. They re-enter negotiations. At that point, Correa is free to engage, not just with the Giants on renegotiating, but with other teams, and to renegotiate with whatever they want. Less than a day later, Carlos Correa comes to an agreement with the New York Mets. 12 years, $315 million. At that point, you're thinking, Correa aside, right? How are the Mets doing this? And that was obviously a huge talking point of this offseason, was how the hell are the Mets pulling off all these free agency signings? And on top of it, my first thought was, how is there something so significant and so serious that it completely wipes out the agreement that the Giants had with Correa, but the Mets seemingly just don't care? They're just going to throw money at him. Well, as it turns out, he had to go through the physical process with the Mets organization as well. And each time you go through this physical process with a doctor and they do these evaluations on your body and these scans and MRIs and mobility and x-rays and everything that you could imagine with your body, it still had to happen with the Mets, just like it did with the Giants. And when those scans and everything else happens, they can't release the medical information that they're discovering with Correa, right? It would be a HIPAA violation. So we don't know what the problems were with Correa. Nobody in the public is like, what, dude? We know he's had some back stuff. We know he's had an ankle thing. We know he's had a hip. Like, we can speculate, but nobody actually knows what is going on behind the scenes. So he agrees to terms with the Mets on a 12-year, $315 million contract. And at this point now, he has agreed to over $600 million worth of contract money between two different teams. The Mets have to go through the physical process with Correa, as they do, doing their due diligence. And the agreement happened between the Mets and Correa on the 21st. On the 24th, reports start surfacing about the Mets' concerns with Carlos Correa's physical. Apparently, as the concerns started to come out and more information became available to the public, and as stuff, generally just tends to leak out, they're finding out that the issue the Giants came up with in the physical process, and then now the Mets are coming across, is the long-term well-being of Carlos Correa and his ankle, specifically an ankle he's had concerns with. At this point, the gigantic 12-year, $315 million contract between the Mets and Correa is now off the table, and they re-enter renegotiations, because at this point, nobody's going to give Correa the long-term contract that he's looking for. They may give him the average annual value. He wanted north of 27, 28, 29 million a year. He could probably still get that, but nobody's going to agree to sign this guy for 10 years after two different teams both came back doing their due diligence on this player and found there's some serious concern with his ankle. So the Mets are now renegotiating. Everybody knows that obviously Steve Cohen, the owner of the Mets, and the Mets in general as a team are operating on a loose cannon, fire on all, just throw money at the issue sort of approach in this offseason. So people are saying, well, okay, the Giants are a little bit more cautious. They don't quite as they're not operating the same way that the Mets are, where they still want to be able to make sure their investments and their money are getting allocated towards resources that will return on those investments. The Mets, however, and Steve Cohen are not operating in the same way, and just give me the best players, whatever it takes, whatever amount of money. So my indication, and a lot of people's indications around the game of baseball, was that Correa was going to find his way back to the Mets. It would just be on a different deal that would get restructured for a shorter amount of time, and that would be the end of it. January 10th, Carlos Correa reaches a 6-year, $200 million agreement with the Minnesota Twins. At this point, Carlos Correa / Scott Boras have negotiated over $800 million worth of money for Carlos Correa in one offseason, which I don't know if that's an actual, quantified record, but I'd have to imagine, because of the rare occurrences of a player not passing his physical, that's gotta be some sort of record for a total dollar amount of money that a player has negotiated for himself. Talks started to accelerate on the 9th. The Twins were always interested in Correa. They always wanted him in some capacity. They just could not keep up with what the Mets and Giants were offering as far as the back end of the agreement, right? The final 5 years, the final 6 years, where they are still going to be having Correa on the books at $29 million a year, $31 million a year. The Twins weren't prepared to commit to that long term of a contract. And then he fails his physical with the Giants. He fails his physical with the Mets. Everything falls into place, and essentially Correa lands back in the lap of the Minnesota Twins, who I feel had way more leverage than they actually had at the beginning of the negotiation process. At the start of it, Correa had a bunch of different suitors, a bunch of teams interested in him, a lot of dollar amounts, a lot of years, and the Twins just couldn't keep up as a mid-market team, and it totally makes sense. But as time goes on, Correa begins to lose value on a week-by-week basis. And every time a physical comes back with concerns, he starts to lose value. Next thing you know, it falls right in the Minnesota Twins' lap. And they're able to commit to a 6-year agreement to a guy who's 28 years old, 2-time All-Star, $200 million a year, or $200 million total over a span of 6 years. If you're going to give a guy $33 million a year, you have to know that you're going to get production out of him. And that's the risk that the Twins didn't want to take at the back end of the long-term contract that Correa was getting offered by other teams. So they signed into a 6-year deal, $200 million, and Carlos Correa had now agreed to $365 million, $315 million, $200 million, totaling, if my math is correct, to $880 million worth of free agency money between 3 different teams. Absolutely unbelievable. I can't believe there's so much money being associated with one single guy. Hats off to the Twins for being able to play themselves back into this situation and kind of take advantage of what was going on. It ended up working out really well for the Minnesota Twins. Again, most people's concerns are that the Twins just simply aren't going to be really competitive and that they kind of just made a splash to make a splash. But they get their guy Correa. He was ranked on a lot of people's boards as a top 5 available free agent this offseason, behind guys like Judge and DeGrom and Trey Turner. Or like I said, there's a lot of debate between which free agent shortstop was really the best available. In a lot of people's minds, it was Carlos Correa. So Correa ends up with the Twins, 6 years, $200 million, and single-handedly levied himself out of over $600 million. But at the end of the day, he gets his $33 million a year. The Twins get their shortstop, and Correa had to have set a record for money committed to a single player in an offseason.